Good morning and a very warm welcome to Nal Sir. We begin the program by offering our welcome in the form of flowers to our chief guest. May I request the Honorable Vice Chancellor to welcome Justice Jeevan Reddy with a bouquet. May I also request Ms. Jyoti, our research associate, to welcome Professor M.P. Singh with a bouquet. Professor Alexander Fisher. May I request the Vice Chancellor to give the welcome address.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to each one of you. My Lord Justice Jeevan Reddy, Professor M.P. Singh, Professor Alexander Fisher, Professor Vasanthi, our research associates, my colleague Ashwini, and the participants to this comparative constitutional law course. It is indeed a matter of great honor for each one of us to have His Lordship Justice Jeevan Reddy here. As Professor M.P. Singh was saying this morning that, we have read his judgments in Indra Sohani and in S.R. Bomai, a very eminent judge and a very learned judge. Sir, I am indeed grateful to you that you found time in spite of ill health of your brother. But this kind of interaction which we would have over a week on comparative constitutional law is indeed very, very important, because we may study constitution, we do in fact in most law schools and other law colleges, but we spend very little time on the idea of constitutionalism. In fact, most people are not able to distinguish between constitutional law and constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is a different ball game, and it is important that we understand this idea of constitutionalism, because you may have constitution but no constitutionalism. So Hitler also had Weimar Constitution and there was no constitutionalism. Several socialist countries had constitutions but no constitutionalism. And even in the liberal democratic traditions, where apparently it may look that we have constitution and constitutionalism, but you get instances where you really experience that constitutionalism has been divorced or it has not been given the importance which it deserves. And that is why we say that if 19th century has seen the death of God, it's a different story that God has come back. We killed God, but God is back. I don't know really whether constitutionalism would be back or not, but in the 21st century, we are experiencing several deaths. So with Trump's victory, there is death of globalization, and of course, there will be, and there is already in number of countries, death of constitutionalism. Now, as all of you are aware, that the humanity has been longing to have a government which governs us well. That's why we created a state. So we wanted to be governed well. But that was not the only goal. In addition of being governed well, we wanted to be free. And to be free, we invented this idea of constitutionalism, that the state would feel powerless in some way. Constitutionalism is an idea of limited government, but no government anywhere in the world ever felt powerless. Therefore, Section 26 of RBI Act may say that you need to have a RBI board meeting to do demonetization, but I have not read a single word anywhere that there was such a meeting. And who were the people who were present in that meeting? I have read Article 300A, right to property may not be a fundamental right, but it is very much a legal right. How can you put restrictions on how much I withdraw? And when I withdraw, after all, this cash is my money. But the governments of the day, they decide. And many a times, through executive actions. So the new government in India, in first 8 months, it equaled the dubious record of Indira Gandhi of promulgating an ordinance every 28 days. It was only, in that strange situation where they were not able to get the nod of Rajya Sabha to the land acquisition bill when it was re-promulgated. And the President of India had to advise the Prime Minister that let's not indulge in ordinance making thing. And I also wrote number of pieces on this, that ordinance, revival of ordinance Raj had come to an end. And why should we blame any particular government or particular Prime Minister? There have been times during Congress regime, in Bihar for instance, on one day as many as 50 ordinances were promulgated. In fact, if you look at the file notings, it will start like this. The assembly session of Bihar Legislative Assembly is over, and therefore now the ordinance must be promulgated. And there were a number of times, Supreme Court saying that re-promulgation of ordinance is absolutely unconstitutional. But even the present NDA government, for the 4th time recently, re-promulgated the enemy property ordinance. And what is this enemy property ordinance? There is a decision of the Supreme Court in a property dispute about one Raja of Mahmudabad near Lucknow. And to undo that judgment, this ordinance is being re-promulgated again and again. So Shahbanu was not the only case which was overturned like this. There are any number of cases which are overturned. Similarly, the effort to control judiciary in the name of so-called quote-unquote merit. People are appointed to National Human Rights Commission. The law is very clear that you need to do something to do with law, something to do with human rights. Politicians, for the first time in the history of National Human Rights Commission, a ruling party vice president has been appointed to NHRC. All appointments, 95% of appointments are made by the government. How they pick up ministers, how they pick up governors, how they pick up chairmen of various commissions or even vice chancellors. We see what kind of merit government takes into account in such appointments. And if at all the merit of judges is to be taken into account, even though the old dictum is that in appointing a judge, look for a good man. If he knows little bit of law, that is an addition, isn't so? But try to find a good man. If at all merit is important, the judiciary is in the best position to examine that merit. This is not to say that I am absolutely, happy with the way the collegium has worked. I have written number of times that the behavior of Indian collegium is similar to the behavior of English weather. It fluctuates, you really don't know. And there have been people who are brought late, there have been people who have not been brought. There is no say for the high court judges, even though the constitution gives them a say. But between the two, between the executive dominating the appointment or judiciary dominating the appointment, of course I feel more secure if the say is with judges. Therefore, I believe that this is an important time to talk of constitutionalism, to talk of freedoms, to understand that you need to feel that limitation. We are not feeling limitation. His Lordship, has chaired a committee on this Armed Forces Act and made recommendations about its repeal. Unlimited power when you give to any state official that is not good for constitutionalism. You need to feel that you can't do this. There is a procedure to do this. And that procedure is important. And therefore I believe that Dr. Vasanti, our professor of constitutional law, needs to be congratulated for conceiving this kind of course where we are bringing people from other law colleges. My lord, our university is closed these days. It's a holiday time. Our students have gone for internships. But I believe it is the social responsibility of NALSAR that we bring students from other colleges and give them some capsule form courses like this, and I am sure that we are going to have meaningful deliberations. I have asked Professor Vasanti not to have too many lectures. We will have some group exercises. There should be a time for each one of you to speak, and I am sure that at the end of this course you will have an altogether different perspective to constitutionalism. And the threats are from everywhere, including judiciary. So when judiciary amends the constitution through judicial verdicts, that is also not good for constitutionalism. And similarly, when you exercise your right to vote, then you should also feel limited in your powers, the way you speak. So if in your shouting of slogans at JNU, you completely forget the limitations of freedom of speech and expression, then you are also not doing a great service to the idea of constitutionalism. So it is not only the state which should feel limited in its power, we should also feel limited. Of course, this is not my case that government should control freedom of speech and expression. That is not my case. So I am sure that we will have fruitful deliberations in this conference. Once again, I welcome each one of you, and welcome our chief guest, Professor M.P. Singh, Professor Fisher, and other colleagues and participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that welcome. I want to give a brief outline of the program that we are going to do for the benefit of our guests, as well as to refresh all of your memory. The idea of doing comparative constitutional law perspectives comes from the kind of scholarship that we are seeing these days, which is beginning to look at the use of foreign judgments more closely. Although all of us as students of constitutional law are aware that the Indian Constitution itself, in its design, is borrowed from several constitutions, and the Supreme Court has been an avid user of comparative law. But in the last 10 years, we are seeing a growing scholarship which is saying, why is it that it is only the developing countries which are looking towards the developed countries for their constitutional imagination? Why isn't there a transfer of understanding or ideas from developing countries to the other countries? The common response that we get to that is that those are the parent constitutions and we are the offspring of that parent, but then the reply to that is that a wise parent always learns from his children. So then when it begins to get into questions of why is it that then the American constitutional law is not influenced by ideas from India or from Asia or from any of the other growing democracies, that the methods that we are using in comparative constitutional law are becoming more important. The case here is not merely that we look at international experience, or the case is not merely that the American Supreme Court must be looking at the Indian Supreme Court, but the method allows you to look at why we are doing comparisons in the first place. What is it that we hope to gain by looking at another experience of constitutional governance? And it begins to ask deep questions of, as Professor Mustafa was referring, why do we have a constitution in the first place? What is it that our constitution, and after all, constitutions are expressions of national identity, a national consciousness. So when it is an expression of a national consciousness, why are we even beginning to look at international experience? What is the merit of it? What is the advantage of it? And the scholarship that we are seeing these days is saying that the advantage of looking at another experience is to help you deal with your own, and to look at your own constitution and look at amendments in that constitution, or look at its provisions afresh. So, for example, we have designed this seminar in terms of a simulation exercise that we have borrowed from Professor Nicole Topovine, who will be speaking to us in the afternoon, wherein she is looking at the idea of constitutions, both in terms of design as well as interpretation, as a method to reach certain goals and objectives. And these goals and objectives are going to change over a period of time. If we see the Constitution as method, if we see the Constitution as process, if we see the Constitution as a means towards a particular end, then how do we understand its provisions? How do we interpret its provisions so that we reach certain meaningful ends? So this discussion on means and ends and the way in which constitutions across the world, the other new change that we are seeing these days is that initially perhaps maybe in the Supreme Court library or a few libraries or the High Court, you had references to international material. It was by and large not accessible to a large number of students of constitutional law. That is not the case today. Today you have access to international material in a way that is unprecedented. But along with access to too much material, the question also is, how do we use this material? How do we know that this particular case is more important or that particular jurisdiction is more important? And these are the questions that have bothered all of us as students of constitutional law, and that is where this idea has come about, that if we have a conversation, and this brings me to the format of the workshop that we are doing. It's more of a workshop format wherein we have a few lectures by very eminent persons, and we are delighted that they have consented to come to this workshop. But the major part of it would be what you are going to contribute. The format requires you to engage with questions of constitutional law, engage with questions of design, engage with questions of interpretation, engage with questions of how best to represent various interests and what are legitimate interests and what would not be legitimate interests for a constitution making. This exercise, we hope, will be able to allow you to use the lectures that we are going to do over a period of 6 days and bring about meaningful conversations. So that is briefly the idea of the program. We have lectures on various themes, such as today we have lectures that are broad and more thematic in the sense of understanding what is comparative public law and how federalism is a mechanism of conflict resolution. Tomorrow we move into rights. The third day we are looking at the judiciary, and then we're looking at South Asian constitutionalism. So we hope that these lectures will give you insights into how one understands constitutional law and comparative perspectives, and we hope that you will be greatly enriched by this experience. So I hope all of you have as exciting a time as we have had in planning for it, and I wish you all the very best. Can I request Professor Mustafa to introduce the chief guest?
Thank you, Dr. Vasanti. Honorable Shri Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy is a son of soil. He graduated from Arts College, Osmania University, secured his law degree from Law College, Osmania University. He started his career in litigation in 1954 and subsequently started independent practice at the High Court of Andhra Pradesh, erstwhile Andhra Pradesh. He was then appointed as the additional judge of High Court of Andhra Pradesh and subsequently made a permanent judge in 1978. He was later appointed as Chief Justice of Allahabad High Court in 1990 and was elevated to Supreme Court in 1991. Honorable Justice Jeevan Reddy has been a part of many path-breaking study reports. I already referred to cases. Indra Sohani, the famous judgment was authored by him, and also in Bombay. To name a few, he headed the committee which examined the need for repeal of controversial Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958, to which I made a reference, wherein the committee recommended repeal of this act and opined that the act is a symbol of oppression, instrument of high-handedness. As to the Supreme Court upholding the constitutionality of Armed Forces Act. Supreme Court has upheld its constitutionality. The committee said it is not an endorsement of the desirability or advisability of the act. What Supreme Court has endorsed, that the legislature had power and competence to enact this law. That's all. The 15th Law Commission was established in 1997 under the chairmanship of Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy. Under the able guidance of Justice Reddy, the Law Commission produced numerous reports touching upon various socio-legal aspects of the society, and some of them leading to enactments of very important legislations. Just to name a few, the 161st report on Central Vigilance Commission and allied bodies, the 165th report on free and compulsory education for children, the 170th report on reform of electoral laws, 172nd report on review of rape laws, 173rd report on prevention of terrorism, Bill 2000, 174th report, very important, on property rights of women, proposed reforms under Hindu law, and subsequently you got the 2005 amendment whereby the Hindu females also became co-partner. In 2011, the Supreme Court of India appointed a high-level special investigation team, SIT, under Justice Jeevan Reddy's leadership to monitor the investigation and steps being taken to bring back black money. 2011 also talking of black money, Now a number of articles have come up that in terms of black money recovered, previous government probably did better in terms of the amount of money recovered. Similarly, in terms of agreements being signed with foreign countries, and also that 2011 you had this SIT. So Supreme Court was also seized with this matter. Justice Reddy has also headed several key sub-panels of National Commission to review working of the Constitution, which was constituted under the chairmanship of former Chief Justice of India, Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya. So I am happy that His Lordship, in spite of his very hectic and busy professional schedule and also personal problems, has found time for us. Sir, I am grateful to you, and on behalf of the university extend you a very warm welcome, and I am sure that this lecture is going to be a treat of the day. Kindly welcome His Lordship, Justice B. Jeevan Reddy. Because of my age.
Please permit me to sit and speak, both because of my age and also because I'm used to speaking while sitting as a judge. Professor Faizan Mustafa, the Vice Chancellor of this great university, Professor Vasanti, Professor M.P. Singh, Professor Dr. Nicole Tupperwine, am I right? Yes. Dr. Alexander. Dear students, I must thank your Vice Chancellor for the kind words he said about me. These are, of course, formal and the usual courtesy which is extended to the guests. The subject matter of this seminar is too wide, is very vast. It comprises any number of issues. Some of them have been touched upon by Mr. Vice Chancellor, some of them have been touched upon by Professor Vasanti. In the circumstances, it is not possible to speak on all the issues which go to make up this vast this subject of comparative constitutional law perspectives. What I would do is, I would take one or two issues and make a few points in that. I'll deal with the comparative features of federalism, comparative features of federalism in Indian and the United States Constitution. There are a number of other constitutions, but there is hardly time for us to go over all those other constitutions. Federation or federal form of government, or what you call the federal constitution, is premised upon the basic tenet of democracy, namely the governing power should not be vested or should not be allowed to be vested on one single organ, one single authority, or one single government. It should be diffused. The governing power should be diffused. The reason is that if you vest it in one single person, it is very often that person is likely to turn authoritarian, dictatorial, or may abuse, very likely abuse his unquestioned power. That's why divide it between the central government, state governments. There will be local bodies like municipalities, municipal corporations. There will be autonomous bodies like universities, public service commissions, and so on and so forth. The governing power is spread out, is distributed among these various, and each act upon checks and balances. I'll come to that presently. Once the governing power is distributed between the center and the states, how do you do it? You do it by making out lists of legislative heads. Our Indian Constitution, it has got 3 lists, as you know. This is elementary, no doubt. That is union list, state list, and a concurrent list. The major and more important wide-ranging powers are included in list 1. And legislative entries of lesser importance, of a more local hue, are put in the state list. Then there is a concurrent list. Where such legislative power is distributed between various organs, there is always a likelihood of some conflict, some difference of opinion arising between these various wielders of governing power. That's why you require an arbiter. That is the judiciary. In India, it is the Supreme Court of India. Supreme Court of India not only decides the disputes between these various organs of governing power, but more importantly, the rights of the citizens vis-à-vis the state and rights of the parties vis-à-vis other parties. Of course, when in a seminar like this, the more important aspect is the determination of...
Kindly switch off your mobiles. It is interfering with the recording system also. Not in vibration mode. Please switch it off.
Thank you. So the Supreme Court of India has been constituted to decide the conflicts which very often arise between the center and the state in the matter of interpretation of the legislative entries. Now while distributing these powers, why is it that more powers are given to the center in India, and to start with more powers were reserved with the states in the United States of America? This is a political come historical development. Each federation is a product of a historical and political process. How it comes about? Take for example United States of America. How was it constituted? Some states, particularly on the northeastern seaboard, came together. They wanted to have a voluntary union and a federal government. Therefore, certain powers were delegated to the central while reserving the rest of the powers with the states. In fact, as you know, the residuary power of legislation under the US Constitution is reserved to the states and not to the center like India. But you come to India, how is it different? We had no concept of a federal or federation, federal state or a federation. It was a unitary state under the British government. It was the British Parliament who, by enacting the 1935 Act, which some people call 1935 Constitution, created these provinces and the central government and distributed the legislative powers between them. You remember, the idea was to give some sort of a self-governance, power of self-governance to these states. They introduced these central they introduced the idea of self-government at the state level, but not at the central level. Under 1935 Constitution, it was never brought into force, the central level. There was no elected government at the center, but the elected governments were brought into existence at the provincial level. They were afraid that the people who come to power in these provincial legislatures, I don't know how they will react, what they will do. There was already a strong movement for freedom. Anti-British feelings were there. Therefore, not only they gave lesser importance, powers of lesser importance to states, but also kept a very strong governor to overrule the legislation, control legislation, to even dismiss the state provincial governments if he chose. It is this reason that the center was very, very powerful compared to the states. Then when Constitution came into force, what was the situation again? We had recently obtained independence, freedom. The situation was chaotic, whether it is 1947 or 1949 when the constitution making came to an end. People were not very definite about the future course of the country, how it will take shape. Therefore, they wanted a strong center. They wanted the states, because it was such a spread out and vast country, that a central government is just not practicable to have with all powerful central government. They wanted to. There were still princely states which is yet to be integrated with the rest of the country. Now, very often people say that Indian constitution is a quasi-federal constitution. What do you mean by quasi-federal constitution? There is no such thing, according to me. There can be difference of opinion upon this question. According to me, there is no such thing as a quasi-federal constitution. A federal constitution is one where the legislative power and the executive power goes along with the legislative power always. The legislative power is distributed between center and the states. The manner of distribution, the method of distribution, the extent of delegation may differ from constitution to constitution. It is not as if the United States Constitution is the only real federation and all the others are less federal or more federal or such thing. Don't compare with America. America is a product of that particular historical process. Our Constitution is a product of a different altogether Indian historical process. Now, people say, why did you, if it were a federal state, why did you include Articles 3 and 4, which empower the parliament to reorganize the states at will, so to speak? Only you have to ascertain the opinion of the concerned legislatures. You can read all the map. They have done it number of times. The idea is, for example, the emergency powers, 356. Why were such powers given which are anti-federal, which militate against the, or which nullify the independent, or not independent, which nullify the authority of the state governments or lessen the importance of state governments? Look, these are not supposed to be permanent features. These are not supposed to be used every day. We have said in Bommai's case that this was an extraordinary, the Article 356 conferred an extraordinary power upon the central government to be used with great circumspection and with good amount of discretion and more importantly wisdom. That was not to be. Almost the situation was before 1994 that wherever the central government found that the state government is constituted by an opposition party, they would dismiss it on some or other ground. The state governments which were manned by opposition were always on tenterhooks. They didn't know when the center would impose this governance and central rule and dismiss them. It was an extraordinary power to be used for safeguarding the Constitution, not for destroying it. Similarly, the power to reorganize, which goes against the concept of federalism, was supposed to be used rarely, with great circumspection, and not utilize it for the purpose of achieving political ends or for momentary electoral advantages. So we must treat, it is not, we should not treat this either Article 3 and 4 or Articles 356 and all as something greatly militating against the concept of federalism. They do, but they were not supposed to be a regular feature. Then we come to the Constitution itself, the way the Constitution is worked. Your Professor Faizan Mustafa has touched upon constitutionalism, has spoken about constitutionalism. I agree. Constitutional law, as we call it, is not comprised entirely in Constitution. Constitutional law means Constitution plus constitutional conventions plus conventions. Conventions which have been developed over the years in England and which we have adopted and borrowed. These together, for example, recently there has been a controversy, all of you must be aware. Whenever a government comes to, a particular political party comes to power in a state, forms the government, the members of the opposition parties, they slowly, by and by, they walk into the ruling group. They clearly are violating the provisions of 10th schedule, that is, they incur disqualification by such desertion. The power is given to the speaker in such matters to decide whether they are disqualified or not. He doesn't decide. He sits over the matter. He allows the 4 or 5 years to pass. Some of those persons who have fled their own parties and joined the ruling group are made ministers. What do you do in such a situation? What can the court do? Can the court say that the most the court can ask the speaker to decide the matter early? 3 months, 6 months, 2 months. He doesn't decide. What are you going to do? Are you going to hold the speaker for contempt? Are you going to say that because speaker has not decided, we will ourselves disqualify? These are situations which were never contemplated. An act is passed by the legislature, sent to the governor. He doesn't give assent to it. He sits over it for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. There is no law which says that he must give his assent within a particular time. He may refer it to the president. There is no law which says that the president must either grant assent or refuse the assent within a particular time. These are all governed by conventions, an understanding. Constitutionalism is an understanding of a culture. It is a culture, constitutional culture. It is an understanding of the way our society should function in a constitutional, in a manner consistent with the Constitution, consistent with law, and consistent with, as I say, wisdom. It is the wisdom which is very often required in such matters. So this is about the constitutionalism. Now the other point which I want to make is that though the power has been distributed between the center and the state, whether in America or India, the international situation, the evolving international milieu, atmosphere, is such that it is tending to make the federal government more powerful compared to the states. Look at what is happened in the United States. Number of jurists have commented that in course of time, the federal government in USA has become more powerful than what was contemplated at the inception of the Constitution. This is because of the developing international situation. But in India, it is not only the developing international situation which of course affects everybody, but it is also a political question. I am referring to what was done under the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution during emergency. As I have told you, more important powers in the Union list, less important powers in the state list, and some other powers in the concurrent list. But what they did under the 42nd Constitution is they deleted some of the legislative entries on the state list, added them to the central list, made some of the entries in the state list subject to the corresponding entries in the Union list. That is further enervation of the states. Now, after the emergency was over, the Janata government came to power. They brought about the 44th Amendment of the Constitution. But look, they amended the provisions related, they deleted, they rectified the provisions, I should say, they rectified the provisions with respect to certain fundamental rights. They rectified the provisions with respect to imposition of emergency and the conditions in which it can be imposed, but did not rectify this taking away of the powers from the state and vesting in the state. They allowed them to continue. That's why he said it is a political process in India where the central government is becoming more and more powerful. Why I am referring to international situation? Take for example the WTO agreements in 1994-95 at Marrakesh. the GATT round of trade discussions. India also agreed to them. Number of things were brought within the purview of the trade which were not initially thought to be part of trade. Intellectual property rights, they were brought within the purview of the agriculture, brought within the purview of the trade, labor standards, brought within the purview of the states, and so on and so forth. To give effect to that agreement, the center was obliged to make laws, and they trenched upon the powers of the state. Agriculture, exclusively the preserve of the state, but with a view to carry out the provisions of the trade agreements, you have to amend, the parliament has to amend the law, trenching upon the state's powers. It was questioned in a particular high court. This was questioned. This entering into these international trade agreements, GATT agreements, WTO agreements, whatever you call them, whereby the state's powers were being trounced, trespassed upon. But they said this comes under the treaty-making power. Because it comes under treaty-making power, it can comprise the rest of the issues. A very unhappy situation. In fact, this unhappy situation of the process of interpretation, I may preface it by saying that in my judgment in S.R. Bommai, I made it a point to specifically say that in view of the fact that more and more important powers are vested in the center vis-a-vis the states, the court should not, by a process of interpretation, make the states less and less powerful, but they must try to preserve the powers that are already given to the states, keep them, keep the powers given to the states as sacrosanct, not allow the centers to step upon it. But when did this process begin? I have got a great grievance against the judgment in what is called the Dhillon's case. In Dhillon's case, that is 1970 or 71, the judgment was by a constitution bench written by Chief Justice Sikri wrote the judgment. The question was whether the income tax or wealth tax for that matter, income tax, can be levied upon the agricultural income. Entry 86 in the Union List, which empowered the Parliament to make a law with respect to income tax, it specifically excluded the agricultural income from the purview of this power. The argument of the state on behalf of the states was, look, the entry is so clear, the Parliament has no power to impose income tax upon agriculture, but this act which brings the agricultural income also within the fold of, within the purview of the income taxable by the Parliament, center, is bad. The Supreme Court adopted a very queer reasoning, a reasoning which according to me amounts to perverting the very idea of division of powers between the center and states. The test they evolved, for the first time the test they evolved was, whenever a question arises, whether a central legislation is within the powers of the Parliament or not, don't go about searching the Union List or any such thing. Look to the state list, state list, list 2. If that subject matter falls within the state list, well and good, the Parliament has no power. But if that item does not fall within the state list, then no further inquiry is necessary because the residuary power under 248 is vested in the Union. The law must be declared to be valid. Assume that this is the way, this is the interpretation. How does it say, how is it an answer to Article 86 and it's clear language, entry 86 and it's clear language? But they said, no, this some sort of I say a patchy argument. They justified upheld the validity of the parliament, including the agriculture income into the property. So this is, unfortunately, this has been followed in later decisions. In fact, we have also been as bound by the earlier decisions have referred to this judgment. The test evolved therein. But this is how the central and states are being operated in our constitution. I've got some more time?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
See, I would like to touch upon a topic which really relates to the manner in which the electoral laws in our country have been enacted and operated. This is also the situation in USA. The defect in US electoral system, as you see from the recent election, is that Hillary Clinton got more votes overall, 1 million or so, but because of the peculiar system prevalent in US, Trump got elected because he got more delegates. That is where, take Florida. Florida has got, let us say, 50 delegates. Out of 50 delegates, Trump gets 26, Hillary gets 24, but all the 50 go to Trump. That is a peculiar system. Now, what is happening in our country? The electoral system, how it operates and how it is less representative than it ought to be. Take UP. There are 4 political parties more or less balanced, not exactly equally, but by and large balanced. You call it SVSP, BSP, Congress and BJP. All the 4 nominate their representatives, their members for election to the particular constituency. Out of, let us say, 1 lakh votes, let us assume for the sake of argument there are 1 lakh votes in that constituency. 80,000 people exercise the votes. The party which gets 21,000, others get 18, another gets 16, another gets 15, like that. The party which gets 21,000 gets elected. That party, that candidate is declared elected. He represents the constituency. He represents the entire constituency, but he represents only 20%, 21% of the constituency. The rest of the votes go waste. There is no voice to those ways. There is no voice to the remaining 79 or 78% of votes. Only the, how is this consistent with a concept of democracy or equality or equal treatment, whatever you call it. Therefore, a suggestion has been made, which is not new in the sense it is already in vogue in certain European countries, what is called the list system. In some countries, European countries, all the members are elected by list. Each party files a list. 100 seats are there. Party A, 100 candidates. Party B, 100. You give 80, 78. So whichever party gets more number of votes, they will nominate. They've got a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 50. 50 were nominated. The idea was that instead of this first past the post system which is now in existence, direct elections, first past the post system, that combined with list system, half-half, or in some proportion, and hold elections so that this wastage of votes is reduced. Not that it is completely eliminated, it is reduced. So this would be somewhat more consistent with a concept of a just federal system, a just representation. Well, there are so many topics which can go on, but I would like to stop here, and I would like to you to put some questions so that whatever questions there are, I would try to answer to the best of my ability. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, all of you. Thank you.
If there are any questions from the participants or from our guests.
Good morning, sir. So my name is Shivam. I am a PhD scholar from the Delhi University. So my question is with regard to the globalization, which is bringing immense prominence to international law, areas which are particularly of domestic concern. Now, international treaties and agreements cover almost all areas which were particularly within the domestic realm. So can we say that relying upon Article 253, the Parliament can render the entire state list redundant?
I'm not able to follow what he says.
So what, sir, he is saying by relying on this international agreement power, can central government make the entire state list redundant? You made this point.
That is exactly my grievance. In fact, in one of my lectures delivered a few years ago, I dwelt upon this issue, that how is this power of treaty making is being abused to undo the division of power, the concept of division of powers under the Constitution. States are being slowly, their powers are being taken away and vested in the center. That is exactly my complaint. Agriculture, sales tax, state excise, everything is being controlled by, is sought to be controlled in the name of trade, in the name of international agreements. Well, that is a problem which which all of you have to think, and maybe somebody has to find a solution.
Next. Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, sir. My name is Nikish Kumar Lamsal. I am from Kathmandu School of Law, Nepal. My question is, Nepal recently has been a federal democratic republic, and it's going for the federalism. And we are very afraid that how could we manage the overhead expenditure of federalism that could have been invested for the development activities.
What did he say?
He's from Nepal. But that we didn't touch upon in this lecture.
Good morning, Your Lordship. Your Lordship, you had stated that you believe that the whole concept of quasi-federalism does not exist. And Your Lordship, I think today, looking at the prevailing circumstances, I primarily feel that yes, we do have features of both a unitary form of government as well as a federal form of government in respect of the Indian Constitution. So why would you say that the quasi-federal concept does not in itself exist? Because we do have features of both existing in respect of the Indian Constitution.
I mean, the idea, as I said, was, even Dr. Ambedkar said that a federation or a federal type of constitution contemplates division of power between the center and the constituent or composing organs. There is no hard and fast rule how to divide these powers. So merely because I don't know, what exactly is your question? I'm sorry, I'm asking you to repeat.
What, sir, she is saying that since the constitution is neither purely unitary nor purely federal.
Why not call it quasi-federal?
Yeah, that is.
Well, that is only an expression. It is still a federal. It is still a federation. You may call it quasi-federal. I don't know. That's why the whole idea is that you start with looking at the US Constitution and judge every other constitution on that basis.
Yes, that is
that is my grievance.
No, but
can
I add, my lord, one more perspective? One, I take my lord's point that American Constitution is not the example of federalism. So each country may have its own historical reasons to reach to a federal constitution. And as you know, that federal constitution is never a matter of choice. Whenever a country is drafting a constitution, if it has choice, it will go for unitary constitution. It is only out of compulsion of circumstances in terms of size or history or whatever, the preservation of diversity, that they opt for federal constitution. But my lord, my question is about Indian judiciary. When the state of West Bengal versus Union of India was decided, the Indian Supreme Court adopted this, that US is the example of federalism. And they said, since there has not been no compact, no agreement between center and states in India to constitute Indian Federation, we are not a federal constitution. And they looked at what she is saying, at the whole scheme of distribution of powers, to say that center has a dominant position. But subsequently, something which Supreme Court said is not there. India is not a federation. Then they turn around and tell us that federalism is the basic structure of the constitution. So why this extreme position that in 50s you are saying we are not a federation, and then you are saying it is the basic structure of the constitution? Can you throw some light on this?
You see, law develops, the legal theories, they are developed from time to time. Take, for example, Article 21 and 22. Gopalan's case was decided in 1950 in a particular manner. They said, when the virus constitutionality of an act is questioned, you just look at the particular entry, whether it falls within that or not, and no further inquiry is made. They upheld the constitutionality of that Preventive Detention Act, whereunder Gopalan was. But then what happened over the years? When we come to bank nationalization, that theory is overruled, 1970. They said no, when all the fundamental rights together constitute a panoply, a panoramic view of the rights granted to the citizens. Therefore, the Act must answer not only the particular entry under which it falls, but also the other entries can also be looked into. So this is how the law develops. I mean, this how the judges initially in the early years, they were very wise and very stable and steady judges, 1950s particularly. Their judgments, they were written very great judgments which lay the foundation of our, but they were obsessed with, they were oppressed with the English law and to some extent the newly emerging, American law which was being followed. Earlier, the American law was not being followed before 1950. It was only since 1950, that too in the matter of fundamental rights, that American Constitution. So their view was restricted in a sense. But over the time, the theorist people have become more broad-minded, or legally speaking, evolving situations, how the world is changing, how the society is changing, how to keep pace, how the law should keep pace with the changing world. These are all the experience. The law is bound to change. Therefore, at initially they must not have said it is not a federation. But now they say it is a federation. Not only it is a federation, but the federal principle is the basic principle, basic tenet of our constitution. That's how see the change. This way, so many things have changed. So many things have changed. Right to property. Constitution itself, right to property was a fundamental rights, 1901G. 1901F. Then they found that First Amendment, Second, Third, Fourth Amendment, and then 17th Amendment, 25th Amendment, all dealing with property, right to property. They got tired of it. They said, remove this from the Constitution. 1901F dropped. We will put it in 300A. Of course, it is still a constitutional right, but not a fundamental right. It is not as if a law which contravenes 300A would be sustained. No. Just as a law contravening 1901F would have been struck down, today also the law contravening 300A will be struck down. But it is not a fundamental right in the sense that fundamental rights have been understood over the years under the Indian Constitution. Particularly, Chief Justice Saburau's judgment in that famous 1968 that where they said fundamental rights cannot be amended. Golaknath case. I have retired from the Supreme Court almost 20 years ago, so my memory is slowly fading. So Golaknath's case. Then we come to Bharati's case in 1973. The theory of it was really borrowed from the West Germany, where they said this power, what should I say? There are certain aspects which the Parliament cannot overstep. They evolved the concept of basic structure, basic features, and said Parliament cannot overstep, cannot override these things. They got it from the West German Constitution. Initially there was no such theory, but why this theory? Now it has become the law. That then what are basic features? Of course is an indeterminate thing that develops in course of time. This is only I am telling you how the law develops. It is not that what was initially said in 1950 is sacrosanct. We may overrule it. We have been overruling it. We will be overruled tomorrow by others. So this goes on like this.
Correct. Any other? Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, is federalism a compulsion rather than a choice in Indian scenario? As looking at Article 3, sir, it gives the only power to the union government to amend the state where the boundary of the state or the changing of the name, sir. Sir, in this reference, I want to make a proposition which was there before. In pre-constitutional law, we had 526 plus states, sir. So it was necessary for the purpose of assimilating them into one state, one union, we devolved some sovereign power to them. In that scenario, isn't this a compulsion rather than a choice? Because if we do not devolve some power, sovereign power to them, they will cede from India. For example, in American Constitution, we see, sir, whenever there is an alteration of boundary or regarding a state, the assent of that particular state is taken. Whereas in India, we did not take that. In Babula,
you need to.
In Babula,
the state assembly has to pass a law.
Yes, sir, but that assent is not compulsive on the union government. Whereas in America, it is compulsive on the union parliament. If you see Babula Paratha versus state of Maharashtra, sir, it was clearly said in Article 3, it is not bounding on the union government, sir. So, in regarding that scenario, is federalism a compulsion rather than a choice for Indian scenario, sir? Question.
I would say those who don't accept federalism, their country gets partition. Had we accepted, cabinet plan and true federalism, we could have averted the partition. And for a country like this, I think there was no choice for us. We had to have a certain kind of autonomy for the states. Therefore, for India or for several other countries who went for federalism, federalism is a better form of government in terms of reflecting diversity. India is so big and so diverse, therefore you had to have a federal constitution. The other thing, sir, I would say that probably the reason of change in the attitude of the court was looking at Gopalan to Golaknath or to Keshavananda Bharati, because initially the court was reposing lot of faith in our freedom fighters who were there in the first parliament and subsequent parliaments, and people like Pandit Nehru who were ruling the country. But that faith in subsequent decades got eroded by misuse of power, and therefore the judiciary had to put its foot down and to tell them initially this was a knee-jerk reaction that you don't have any power to amend fundamental rights. So this was an extreme, as this was an extreme that you can do anything whatever you want. And therefore this happy wedding of two extremes when we said you can amend any provision of constitution but you can't amend the basic structure. So I take his lordship's point that the constitution evolves, but as far as your question is concerned, I think we were not in any different situation compared to those 13 American colonies. The only thing was that there the initiative came from those colonies. And if I can take you to the whole idea of constitutionalism, since his lordship referred to this whole question of popular vote and the delegate thing, while we wanted a central government, a more powerful central government in US, the other idea was to make it less democratic. That's why, House of Representatives, which is the most democratic institution, has the smallest tenure, and Senate has a 6-year tenure. So the whole idea of this constitution, present American constitution, was to keep status quo. And therefore, because they wanted to somewhat control popular majorities, you would remember that Shai's rebellion, when people used to march to state assemblies, get the loan waivers and get the exemptions from payment of taxes. So they wanted to create a government away from the states. People will not be able to go to Washington to protest, and therefore status. So there is several dimensions of one thing which I am sure that over this week we will be able to somewhat discuss in different context. I think we can have a break here, Vasanti, because I think we are now behind schedule. You can have maybe a short tea break and come back.
I am the guilty party probably.
No problem, sir.
It is a privilege to be able to propose a vote of thanks. We had to cut down the session because of the time constraint, but I hope we can continue the discussions in the next sessions. I am extremely grateful to your lordship for having spared the time and giving us such important insights into how we understand the importance of provisions like the federal constitution, what federalism really means, pointing to the roots of federalism in terms of certain political arrangements and what it means for constitutional discussions. I am indeed very grateful to you, sir. I am also extremely grateful for Professor Faizan Mustafa taking time away from his very busy schedule to be with us and participate and ask so many interesting questions and steer the debate in this way. Thanks are also due to the Sakla Center. Professor Balkrishna Reddy was unfortunate, he could not be here today, but thanks are due to him for making all the arrangements to ensure that all of you are comfortable and being in touch with you throughout. Thanks are due to both Jyoti and all the persons at the Sakla Center. And of course, this program would not have been possible without the participation of our guests who have been from the beginning. Both Professor N.P. Singh and Professor Fisher have steered the way in which this workshop would actually be structured. And of course, thanks are due to all the participants for showing so much enthusiasm in a subject and allowing us to conduct this workshop. May I request all of you to join us for a cup of tea outside. Thank you.